Welcome, welcome. People are starting to trickle in. Hey, everyone. Guest today is Michael Feathers. You probably know him as the author of Working Effectively with Legacy Code. To me, this is kind of like the book on wrangling debt-ridden code. For a lot of me and many others, it's one of the top programming books. It's greatly influenced my career. So thanks, Michael. I will say I keep having to rebuy it as I leave it with teams I work with. So I think I'm part of your customer, your lifetime value equation there.
Thank you.
So hit us up on chat if you agree. If there's a part of the book, that really resonated with you that you carry with you, in your career today, we would love to kind of just hear that. So Michael is the founder and managing director of R7K Research and Conveyance. I know him from his world travels, keynoting conferences. It's kind of where we keep mixing up once in a while. And, he's helped a whole bunch of organizations get a handle on gnarly systems, improve their, not just like technical designs, but organizational designs and skills around that. So I really appreciate that socio-technical breadth. And I, see him as a very careful and considerate systems thinker. So I always get something from our interactions and conversations. And with that, I want to welcome you, Michael. Welcome.
Great. Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
All right, we're gonna start with something kind of more meta, right? So, what's the most common question that you get asked? You've been in a lot of webinars and podcasts and panels and stuff like that. And follow up to that, what's a question you wish you were asked a little bit more or at all?
Okay. Well, most common question is when is there a second edition of Working Effectively Legacy Code coming out, right? And I guess the simple answer to that is there's nothing in plans right now. Essentially, people are still finding value from the original book, and I think the technology examples still work to a strong degree, despite the fact that we have a lot of newer languages now. And I don't know, it's a touchy topic for me because I feel like I should do it, but it's also kind of like,
Yeah.
it's really a big deal to go and write something, and I have to feel strongly about it. As far as questions I wish people would ask, I guess there's two. One is kind of like, how do I know when a design is right? I think that's something that I think, it's an open question. I think there's no real answer to that. But I think it's also kind of like when you ask that question, you're kind of looking at all the trade-offs in particular context. And I think we should probably have more conversations about things like that. The second one is kind of like, I don't really have a term for it, but I keep thinking of it as the problem of extras in a way. And what it comes down to is this, essentially it's hard to write software, right? And we have no dearth of like amazing, techniques and methodologies and practices that we can use. And some of them basically really pay off if you apply them diligently, throughout your life cycle and all of your development. And it's kind of hard to know which ones to pick. And beyond that, to have discipline for practices that where you don't see the immediate payoff for them, right? So it's kind of like if you ask a team, it's like, well, why don't you do TDD? And they're going to look at it like, oh, well, don't really need to do that to deliver software. So it's kind of like an extra. Do I really need that extra? And I think that's like a real open question with discipline and practice. And don't have an answer on that either, but I think it's really an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah. It is weird because there's this kind of age-old battle of like almost like trying to anticipate in your designs what might come up in the future. And I think like TDD is inherently much more of a mindful, present oriented way, and you kind of build the confidence that whatever comes down the line,
Yeah.
the emergent design philosophy, right? And those are two very different things. And I've kind of seen where sometimes anticipation might be a little bit more right. And there's like a nuance in a certain domains where, kind of correctness or regulatory domains or something like that, where you can kind of have a little bit more of you should almost have a longer horizon on design. Whereas emerging innovation work, it's almost always a mistake. Have you seen that in kind of clients that you've worked with or your travels?
That comes up. The thing I would just kind of like, I guess, add to that is kind of like it's a big thing in the process realm also. Like, are we going to do TDD, for instance? Especially if we don't see the payoffs right away, for instance, right? There's all different things that we could, like particular types of review and stuff like that we can put in place to help us out, but it's a question of like whether those things really pay off in a way, right?
Mm,
Um, it's funny about this too because I've recently kind of like rediscovered, I guess, the notion of checklists, and it's kind of like just really there's a book that was written a long time ago called the Checklist Manifesto, and I think Mary and Tom Poppendieck were basically sort of like talking about this a long time ago. But it really is interesting to find that like aircraft maintenance and also surgical teams rely intrinsically, heavily on checklists to go and sort of give themselves some guardrails when they're doing their work and some auditability for the work that they do. And I keep wondering whether that's something we should be doing in software development particularly for critical work. It's like, it comes down to a question of like, how serious are we? Right. And I think that's, if we do want to get serious about things, then we should consider something like that. I haven't personally done that with a team at all, but I think it's an interesting thing to consider.
I feel like my team, I'm kind of regularly annoying them with checklists, and we're
Cool.
socio-technical domain. We're doing kind of product and technical coaching,
Yeah.
but a big believer in that book. Great book. Check it out. Checklist Manifesto.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to something else. So this one comes with a micro story for me. I feel like simplicity for me was a real journey in getting to that, where I kind of value trying to strive for simplicity, in the there's a difficulty associated with that in architectures and designs. And I particularly transitioned from, like, my first phase was like get shit done coder, go really fast, really sloppy, super prolific, not really having to deal with it, to then I think the next step was really getting sucked into the high church of OO and patterns, and that's kind of where I became aware of your work. And then, you know, moving toward a more simple and maybe even like functionally inspired approach. But those are like three different, very radically different kind of ways of approaching solving some of the same problems. And now kind of I'm begrudgingly accepting the working with thinking machines thing. I was really salty about the hype. I still am a little bit about the hype,
Mhm.
but I'm kind of experimenting and seeing, okay, yeah, there's some things happening. So, all that said, I'm kind of curious about the significant shifts in your career, and how you've kind of navigated those over the years. And, particularly, I know, like, when the functional stuff came around, you kind of started experimenting with that. I'd really like to know how you experiment, and what are you doing in this kind of AI era?
Sure. Okay. First things first. Yeah, the functional stuff, it was just kind of like there was, again, so much material around when I was basically first starting to dig into it. I think the thing that I kept going back to was kind of like, okay, well, this is supposed to be side effect free programming. So let me find a stateful program, and one that basically a program that has lots of side effects, and sort of ask, how would I actually write this thing? Right. And it just became this constant thing of going and trying to find little problems I could use to go sort of like reorient my thinking in that space. Um, and I think, it's really kind of interesting. I think it was kind of funny. I was at a conference and I was talking to somebody who had way more experience with functional programming. And I said, well, how do you produce like a frequency histogram from a list of numbers? And it's like we had a napkin and the guy went and wrote out, he used the group by operation in Haskell. And I'm like, man, okay, I can see that now, right? It's kind of like I just couldn't figure out how to do it without mutability, that kind of thing. But it really comes down to like honing in on the differences and figuring out what's different in this context and being curious and kind of digging into it. And I think I'm doing the same thing with AI in a sense, right? It's kind of like I have a model in my mind of what it might be good for and what it might not be good for. And then it's a thing of like, just trying to go and hone in and sort of figure out where I'm right and where I'm wrong in those areas, right? I know I say this quite often when I speak to people, but it's kind of like I really feel it's so important. It's like if you're curious about these things, you'll dig in. And it's really just like I try to foster that kind of curiosity in myself, to go and try to, sort of deal with these things. Some things like cloud, I kind of like, hung back from cloud for a period of time because I wasn't quite sure the industry would do it because it didn't seem like companies would be like willing to go and put all their sensitive data in and, third party like vendor, systems. Um, and like JavaScript, I held off for a while because I kept thinking, well, at some point the frameworks will settle down. Never happened, right?
Yeah.
So it's that thing of like deciding when you're going to get in. For AI, it was just interesting enough for me to go and sort of get in early.
Yeah. I saw something on social media. It was like 75% of sites still run on jQuery. I can't validate the source, but wouldn't surprise me,
Yeah.
if that's the case. Yeah, it's interesting. I think, one thing I kind of associate you with is kind of principles and developing kind of strategies that can be
Yeah.
reused and applied in different, sometimes different problems, different contexts and stuff like that. Is that like as you're kind of adopting these new things, how do you I'm just maybe this is not answerable, but how do you start to extract those principles, or do you see it 3 times? Like what is the
I guess I'm always looking for commonalities and differences, like I was saying a little bit earlier. It's really, it's yeah, it really is that. Essentially, if I look at other domains other than programming and software development and I see something similar, I'll ask myself, gee, is this really the same as this thing or is it kind of different in a way? Right. And then I'm kind of looking to go and say, is there a common idea behind these things? And I think the reason I do this is just because it seems like it goes and sort of gives us a better chance at creativity. It's kind of like if you can find something which looks like a durable pattern across many different domains. It's kind of like, when another problem comes up, you might go and say, well, gee, here's an idea from someplace else. Let's go ahead and try to use it. I remember being impressed when there was a Java technology called Genie, Jini, okay, way back in the day. And they basically talked about like having leases, for the services and stuff like this. And apparently the concept of leases came from like DCHP, right? And it was kind of interesting to go and kind of look at that, but it's kind of like superficially looks like you're borrowing a concept from the domain of like rentals and property, right? And basically using it in software. I guess a metaphor in a sense. But the interesting thing to notice is that basically we see problems solved all the time in life in many different areas, accounting, whatever. And if we can sort of discern what those patterns are and what the principles are behind them, then we have a chance to go and actually just use them creatively and creative combinations to solve different problems. So that's where I get the payoff for it, and a lot of it is just like pattern matching, I think.
right, right. Awesome. So let's go a bit more specific and a bit more contemporary. How are you experimenting with, kind of AI LLMs these days? And kind of this is a bit of a flip question, but what is working effectively with AI look like?
Yeah, to be determined. I guess we're really all trying to figure that out. One thing to say up front is that I don't my emphasis has not been on figuring out how to embed LLMs in products at all, but rather what do LLM-based technologies mean for developers and the way that they work with code and the way they design systems and work with systems. And I feel that's just like my, wheelhouse in a sense. The thing of LMs and yeah, I feel like that's going to get settled and I'm not going to have anything to do with it. I'll be happy about that. And it'll be okay. Right.
Right.
Um, but in terms of the development thing, I think it's like we really have these challenges where it's kind of hard to know whether what you're seeing is really something which is correct, that kind of thing. So I'm basically just working on different ways of working with LMs in order to go and sort of like, different practices that you can use to go and sort of just, you know, um, kind of like set yourself down a path that, tends to work out for you. The main thing I'm kind of noticing is that essentially, even if we're not able to go and deterministically produce code that goes and does exactly what we want it to do, just using LMs as ideation space is just wonderful, right? Um, the way I typically work is I'll have small little sessions that are open to solve specific problems, or I'll be using like an IDE with embedded AI. I always have like my most capable LLM available in a chat window. And I basically go and ask it general questions like, here, let me paste in this code. Give me 3 different ways of doing this, that kind of thing, right? Usually very open-ended questions. And it pays to go and sort of like ask the question more than once, because you'll be surprised by the differences sometimes. So it's kind of like this machine for going and actually sort of getting different points of view on things. And that's where I find it very useful. So yeah, that and I guess also noticing that there's this other thing that I think we're gonna have to go and center on, which is kind of like what's the appropriate size to generate or work on, where we can basically sort of optimize our flow. Because if you generate too much, you're stuck in the thing of like, okay, well, how do I actually go and verify that this is correct? And review takes time. We know that. So it's this thing of chunking and modularization. I think modularization becomes a bigger issue with AI than it is previously. So
Yeah. I'm mostly self-taught programmer, but I did take a handful of CS classes when it became clear I was headed down this direction. And, you know, what I remember from CS 101 was structured complexity, right? That was kind of one of the things I really remember. It's like, hey, you know, you have this big program, we're going to break it into modules and break those into functions or routines or whatever
Mhm.
at the time. And it just seems like that is, you know, an obvious one of, you know, foundational level thing that we all kind of learn at the beginning of the journey. But it seems very like this is kind of proving that idea, right? It's like the
Mhm.
more, you know, if we can, in the aggregate, look at something as a series of a few attributes and then drill into one of those attributes and, you know, kind of you get this fractal thing going on. These things, at least right now, tend to work much better. So yeah, it's kind of reinforces like good training and good taste and good, you know,
Yeah.
practices, you know?
If you don't mind me, I'll expand on that a little bit if you don't mind, but it's
Yeah, go
like
for it.
called Miller's Law, which is sometimes called the 7 plus or minus 2 principle, and it basically
Mhm.
deals how many things you can have in your working memory at once, your short-term memory. And it's kind of like it is kind of bounded to some degree for everybody, right? But the interesting thing about that is that that kind of stuff just kind of plays into module size for us, right? What's the chunk we can keep in our mind all at once? And it's like if you go beyond that chunk, you end up having like comprehensibility problems, right? So that's why we modularize. And I think it's very interesting to notice that the attention mechanisms in LLMs basically have that same constraint. We tend to call it like the context window problem right now.
Yep.
So we think this thing of if we can see that as all being the same problem in a way, it's kind of like how do you focus in on something and basically make it so that you can work with it? And it may be we may be getting to the point where AI has a bigger context window than we have.
Mm.
And then the question becomes, do we allow that to be a runaway train? Or do we basically go and try to keep things at our level of comprehensibility, which I think might be an important thing in many systems.
Yeah. I kind of see I kind of fear that, like, at least in the enterprise where I, tend to work, you're gonna have this, almost like fast fashion kind of approach to architecture where everything's discardable units and,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, relying on the definition of component as an interface of replacement or unit of replacement.
Mhm.
Um, and that's I guess if the result is the same and you can just replace it, does it matter? Probably not. That's more futurism, I think, but, uh, you know, and maybe that's, you know, depending on where you work, that's already happening, you know,
Mhm.
kind of thing. So, but interesting. Yeah, back to your kind of point too is like AI is like a buddy. I think there is a lot of value just to rejecting what it comes back with sometimes. And I find myself saying, "Hey, give me an idea. Here's a, you know, some context
Mhm.
prompt, whatever." And I get something back and I'm like, that's just hot garbage. And it kind of reinforces my will to just do it the old fashioned way sometimes. Yeah.
Let me tell you what I really hate right now. Basically, a lot of LLMs are kind of like tuned in a way that they basically want to sort of give you assurance and kind of confidence in the things that you're doing. So I'll basically take an idea and pitch it to an LLM, and they'll say, "That's very interesting insight, Michael." I'm kind of like, "No, I want you to tell me it's utter garbage."
Right.
And these are the things which make it better. And it's an interesting thing because a lot of that's like usability, but it's also kind of like it's profit in a way too. Basically, you know, customers want to basically feel they're doing something valuable. Customers of various LLM services or, you know, AI services. And, you know, it can be like imparting false confidence. And I think that's problematic. I think for people like us, programmers, engineers, we want to know when things aren't right, you know, and it's kind of like that's our critical thing. If we don't care about that, we're lost, you know.
Yeah. Good point. Yeah. So, okay, let's switch it up. You had a bang, what I would call a banger of a post on LinkedIn the other day, summed it up really well. A quote, so many opinions on AI for developers. Here's mine. It isn't nothing and it isn't everything. Discount any opinion at those extremes. Can we discuss maybe or postulate what kind of outcomes you see happening on either end of that spectrum or those extremes?
Well, you know, I think it's almost like self-extinguishing in a sense. It's kind of like if there are people that basically think that AI is not really going to change anything, well, they'll find out very quickly that basically a lot of things are changing, even if it's very quiet within development. And for people who basically claim it's like, oh my God, it's going to replace us, it's going to basically sort of like do this and that and everything like that. takes time for things to change, and it's probably not going to go as far as people hope for these kinds of things. I think the thing that I struggle with quite often is basically people who've been in the industry, maybe not as long as you and I have, but with a good number of years, maybe 10, 15 years of experience, um, being so kind of scared that they become utterly defensive and they just basically discount it out of hand and say, okay, well, nothing new here. It's not going to take over. Ignore all this AI stuff. It's going to go away. No, it's not going to go away at all. Right. So basically, as soon as you confront your fear a bit and start to go and get involved with it, you start to discover where it's going to work and where it isn't. And I think that, the answer isn't there yet for that. It's like where it's going to work and where it's not going to be all that great. At the very base level, it's like we have code completion tools, which we've had for decades prior to this, but just better ones using AI, and that's not going to go away, I think at all, right? Whether we actually get to the point where we're basically going and generating very large systems deterministically that basically, adhere to a spec, and we care about, have to see where it goes. I think it's just an
Yeah.
open question.
Yeah. One of the guys I work with, Matt Plavkin, saying, he was wondering aloud to me, and I'll paraphrase. I don't want to quote him directly, but he was saying that, don't you think all the software that needs to be written has been written? I am it kind of like, I'm like, what do you? I mean, I think a lot of it has. My answer to him was, in all that software will approach crisis and need to be rewritten at
Mhm,
some point, kind of, mm, not quite the fast fashion, but just saying human nature entropy tends to set in. And,
mhm.
I know we've both been part of a lot of those projects, right? In our career. What do you think about, like, software? I mean, this may be too heady, but software is like a medium, and the frontier for software really out there. Do you think, is it as dire as most of the software that needs to be written has been written?
And I mean, the thing is that this is timeless, and I can't remember which guy it was that was actually like appointed to be the patent examiner or patent clerk for the US back in the 1800s. And the president was appointing him, and he basically said back, it's like, why? Everything that's useful has been invented already, right? And then one from my own experience in the middle 1980s, a friend of mine was in business and he had a great computer, and I wanted to play with the computer and playing with his computer and stuff like this. And I started taking CS courses, and he's like, Michael, why are you going to do this? It's like, in a couple of years, all the programs that need to be written will be written, and it's like, this is the middle 80s, So I think it's like we always shortchange what people are going to want in the future. And I think one of the things I keep coming back to is this, that essentially human need is always far in excess of what we can produce, right? So as we basically go and have higher and higher capabilities with software, we're just going to want more, and I think that's just going to
Yeah.
be like a thing. And it's like, I don't think we have to worry about that at all. Whether software is going to be the medium going forward for this or not, I feel strongly it will be, because there's nothing quite as flexible as software. Biology is really flexible, but it's slow,
Yeah.
so it's just, I don't know. I could be surprised, and this may just all be kind of shoved off to the side, but I can't really see what would do it right now.
Yeah, it's kind of like the Buckminster Fuller thing, that
Mhm.
ephemeralization. It's like your capabilities become more and more such that you can make more and more with less and less, such that you can make everything with nothing, and you kind of see that in hardware design, right? It's like
Yeah,
everything's
yeah.
a black slab, um, shiny slab. And I think there's a little bit of that going on, here. This is clearly one of the mediums that permits that futurism to be
It also allows us
insightful.
easier messes too, or bigger messes. So
True.
it's
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I've done my part there. I will tell you that much. Cool. Let's see. Let's get out of. Oh God, so many AI questions. It's just like it dominates. Okay, here's one. It's fun, and you did kind of hit on this a little bit, but I'd like to maybe get into some of the specifics. So you did a keynote recently that I was at, um, and you mentioned that, one of my takeaways is this idea that every generation kind of reinvents principles and rediscovers for themselves, and it is like very much of that constructivist, all knowledge is created idea, and it was kind of insightful to me. You also mentioned that a lot of the principles over the ages that have some symmetry or kind of can be grouped kind of roll up to a big meta principle.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, let's unpack that for our listeners.
Well, that talk you're talking about is, something that was kind of like an experiment because I like to basically find principles and stuff like this. So I was trying to go and sort of, scoop through all the different ones that I've ever heard of and did some research and try to figure out what's common across all those. So I ended up with something, maybe I'll mention it in another minute or so. But I think in terms of like the knowledge thing and the industry, it's like, yeah, we are constantly like reinventing things. And it's notable that the things that we invent basically all rhyme in a sense. So there's some stuff that's foundational to the things that we do. Um, a thing that I'm always amazed at is basically how much stuff gets kind of like thrown in the garbage heap once it's not, doesn't have contemporary utility. I remember reading something a long time ago that essentially like the people that designed dirigibles back in the early, 20th century, there were whole areas of mathematics that were developed for dirigibles. And then it's kind of like now it's in notebooks someplace, but nobody has a reason to go back to it. So I think there's the things that are like that, which aren't quite as durable, and others, that basically are far more durable. Um, and I think just as a plug for an idea, I think the thing that I really keep coming back to is that it really pays to read old sources, like in technology and stuff like that. Just not just to go and get the ideas, but also to go understand how people thought back then and how they think differently now. And I find that valuable, and it's kind of hard for me to go and explain why I find that valuable. I think just it's that old thing of like the number of perspectives you have when you're looking at something really gives you something if you see things from many different perspectives. So yeah, I think it is reinvention. It's kind of like it's how can we look at it like this? It's kind of like, when they dig up an archaeological site, the reason they're digging is because dust is basically filtered down over the eons to cover this area up. And it's like, I guess our dust rises faster in the industry, and we just have to basically kind of like scoop down with a shovel periodically and see if there's anything there that might be useful.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of experienced that sensation of, I was involved in like the blogging era, right? And
Mm.
that sensation of the next wave of talent writing about the same things on Medium. I'm like, haven't we been there? But I think it's just the way it works. I I've always been a crate digger, and a lot of the stuff I've kind of, I mean, Conway's Law is 1968 or 1969.
Yeah, yeah.
Fred Brooks. So there's like a lot of really good stuff back there that you can, you know, uh, have fun and profit with. I think, I wonder, I will tell this story, real quick story, anecdote
Mm.
really. So this one came to me because I wrote this technical blog post. I'm like, isn't it cool? Look what I've done. I've managed to use interfaces, marker interfaces to be able to create grammar with a fluent interface, which really dates the time because I think we all remember when that was like the big thing. It's like I can just
Mhm.
have this dot like
Yeah, chaining
internal
things up.
DSL. Yeah. And Steve Freeman, who was one of the creators of JMock, commented on my post and he's like, have you ever used JMock? And I'm like, oh yeah, okay. That's where maybe I got that idea from. I don't know. I've been a part of it on both sides, I think. It's like, and so at this stage I'm like, cool. Like I think it's spread of knowledge is kind of what matters to me most as a part educator. But anyway. Um yeah, so let's move on. Okay. So in the we'll go back to AI. All right. So and I kind of want to just throw this out as a broad topic. So I'll just kind of put a few bullet points out here. AI, scares me from a kind of over reliance perspective. And I really, I think a lot of different domains, not just technology and software, are really concerned about like second order effects and safety and stuff like that. But like, let's constrain it to our space and think about like, okay, we have all these agents going, just cranking out code. Everyone's now part-time supervisor of these kind of AI agents. What are those some of those second order effects that we can kind of anticipate? Like what, kind of imagining like what could go unexpectedly right or wrong with this?
Yeah, I think. the things that can go wrong, I think they're like on the tip of everybody's tongue. It's kind of like we're going to have a lot more, bad code or like horrific examples where basically things were deployed that never should have been deployed, things like that. I like to look at the positives a little bit because I think it's kind of, everything has trade-offs and there's a lot of good things that can happen as well. The thing I'm kind of like centering on now is I think that we're going to become much better at judgment, right? Because we're going to be wading through a lot of things that don't quite work. And so, it's like that thing of like, okay, ask the same question twice of AI, you get different answers, right? Somebody has to make the call there, and it's not going to be AI because you're the person asking the questions. You have to make that call, right? So I think that basically judgment's going to come at a premium. And I think that basically AI, in a sense, its current generation of AI is going to be training us to basically develop better judgment skills.
Hmm.
So I think that's a positive thing that can kind of come out of this. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of negatives. I think the thing that I worry about a lot is kind of like, well, nobody can do long division anymore because calculators, right? But essentially the thing is, it's kind of like, I think creativity and problem solving are things that, we really are in a poor state when we basically rely on AI to the point where we just don't do that stuff anymore. And one of the things I've been writing up recently is just like a bunch of different techniques for AI. And one of them is essentially kind of like modes of interaction. Like one is to go and sort of ask a question and get an answer. And the other is kind of like, okay, I've got a problem. Let me try to solve the problem first. And then I'll ask AI and see how its solution compares against mine. And I love doing that because it's a way of me testing myself in a way, right? And it's kind of like, and I feel also that essentially if somebody gives you something for free, which is, and with AI, it's almost essentially free. It's kind of like it's not gonna make that much of an impression on you. If you had to struggle for something, struggle for a solution, and then you get another solution that shows that, wow, your struggle wasn't all that great because here's the other thing, right? That leaves a bigger impression, right? And when I get better solutions, I'm kind of like, gee, why wasn't I thinking in that path? And I start thinking about what I've read and what I've done that's basically led me to a path where I wouldn't have seen that particular thing. So I think there's like a self-improvement aspect, which is very possible with AI, depending upon the way that we use it.
Yeah. I, it's interesting. I'm kind of concerned about matters of taste and judgment.
Mhm,
And, I think that the path to that, which it sounds very elitist to say, but the path to that was, you get mentored, you join a team where you're maybe a little bit junior and you kind of get lifted up and there's a so really strong the vibe is social, on
mhm,
that team. It isn't vibe coding, as much. And I'm a little bit concerned that the kind of conditions we have now around, particularly around like remote, around kind of these agentic tools and
mhm.
stuff like that, really kind of is going to force you to the middle or toward the left side of the capability curve, and it's going to take a lot to escape that because we're not building those structures to do that. The classic is like, hey, 5 years ago is like mobbing and pairing is kind of where I would wanna be with a team, and now
Mhm.
it's shifted quite a bit. Um, it's almost like a total uphill battle to get folks to do that. So I
Yeah.
don't know where that taste goes or if that becomes extinct or like maybe you have a more I like your a little bit more of an optimistic the usage patterns can kind of teach you that taste a little bit, but I don't know. Dev prod and stuff like that kind of thing pushes people to get it out the door, and I'm a little concerned about
Yeah, and
how.
I am too. I think it's one of those things that trial and error is basically the root of all this, right? Either I learn in trial and error on myself or with you, pairing or something. So it's a question, I guess, of the quality of the feedback, right? And sometimes it's unfortunate people don't receive feedback for bad things until late, like a very terrible deployment, or something like that. But luckily we get earlier feedback with these things. As far as the taste is concerned, I've been amazed that essentially there's so much of software design that is kind of like, again, it kind of rhymes with design in other fields and stuff like that. So I think a lot of that stuff isn't really going to go away. I think we're going to have the taste problem as long as we don't have systems completely generating code that we don't have to look at ourselves. I think that's the real threshold with this, and we're really like in a race you know between that possibility and us basically going and sort of like getting knowledge out there about like how best to go and sort of understand designs that we're working on, right?
Yeah.
Um, I think I explained that very well, but it's kind of like I think there are basically two things that are possible there, and it really comes down to everybody wants this thing of like, okay, generate code that we don't have to look at, right? And basically make things so deterministic that it's kind of like, you are compiling a Java program and you can look at the P code that's generated, right? The bytecode, and sort of like see that that is deterministically the thing that you put in. But here we are, we're dealing with technology which basically accepts fuzzy, and then we have to basically go and get deterministic from it. And it's tough. It's going to be very tough for a long time.
Yeah. It's interesting, it's kind of reading between the lines. I think one of the things you said in there was that the taste problem we had 5 years ago, we had 10 years ago. It's like it's almost like it's just changing the tools, but the the problem remains, and it is just one of those problems you just have to keep putting energy into. The energy might change a little bit, but
Yeah, and I think people got to be able to think deeply about things. I think one of the things that is kind of interesting is like Bitcoin, for instance, right? I remember sort of like when I was trying to understand it in the very beginning, and of course, nobody can ask the person who invented it because we don't know, right? But it's kind of like it felt very interesting that you've got this technology where basically you're able to go and have a chain, and you're basically going using proof of work in order to validate it, and that's going to cost a lot of compute. And then it seems like, okay, well, how can we use this? Where's the serendipity? The serendipity is to go and make a currency out of it, right? Because then it pays for itself to some degree. There's an incentive to go and actually get more of the currency, so that goes and pays for the compute. And I think that there's that kind of interesting design thinking, which is basically trying to find things where there's like a happy coincidence of things when you put them together. And I think that's like basic creativity. I
yeah.
think, you know, hopefully we'll always have people trying to find those things. I think that's the thing that is pretty powerful.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I feel like the um kind of along those lines, like our group and the work we do often pushes teams up toward consider yourself a designer, consider yourself an architect, which means a whole new toolbox and a whole new kind of perspective,
Yeah.
trade-offs and some of the things you're mentioning, and it's like the democratization, so to speak, of that kind of architecture design role versus,
Mhm.
so it's like instead of guardrails, we'll have guideposts and we'll have kind of coach you toward better technical choices. I think this feels like this AI stuff will accelerate that, maybe through a series of crises, but it will
Yeah.
probably make, it's so where if you're managing an agent fleet, you kind of have to have situational awareness, a much broader situational awareness than my editor and, my PRs and things like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
One could hope, right? You look for the silver lining. Hey, let's take a question from the group here. And I just want to remind you, if you have a question or topic for Michael or I, go ahead and put it in the QA feature. I hope I get the name right. Mohammed Sufyan asks, he's got two questions. Let me pick the right one. With generative AI, we are reducing the cost of writing software. How do you think refactoring will evolve when the cost of rewriting gets cheaper?
Well, superficially, it looks like we're basically going and reducing the cost of writing software. And I think we are to some degree, but it really comes down to us going and confronting the things that we need to do that we're not doing, like review and stuff like that. That might go and cause things to take a little bit longer than the initial promise. So there are some reports basically like in open source, people committing way more often, but also kind of like, basically going and have to do bug fixes far more frequently as well. Um, so yeah, I think we're going to get an acceleration from some of these things. Refactoring, I think it comes down to that whole determinism thing. It's kind of like, how much confidence can I have in refactoring that's done by AI? And there's a lot of groups that are basically trying to make headway on that. And I think they're doing pretty well. Um, but I think the thing to recognize is it's always easier to write software that is difficult to work with than to refact. No, sorry. Yeah, it's always easier to create a mess than it is to refactor things. And that's just entropy. That's the way the universe works. So I think we can't really count on AI to go and solve all our problems in that sense,
Mhm.
because I think we're going to be creating problems in excess of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Okay. So I think, yeah, I'm going to ask you this question. We're kind of going to wind down because I know you gotta bounce for another meeting after
Yeah.
this. But um, so much change going on right now, in geopolitically, which we're not going to get into, obviously.
Mhm.
But in our industry, we talked about this AI thing, all that. Like, it's late stage capitalism, all this stuff, right, is kind of going on, and I sometimes wonder, like, is this worth it? Assuming that you don't have to do this for ramen, right? I'm just kind of curious. Were there any moments in your career where you're like, take this job and shove it. I ain't working here no more. To hell with this gig. To hell with this industry. Um, and I think that's natural, right? We get frustrated and stuff like that, and especially during times of extreme change. But I'd love to know what keeps you going as a programmer. Like, I see you as ultimately, a programmer who educates, consults, and all that, but a programmer. And
Yeah.
and what advice would you have for like people that are just getting into this racket?
Well, I guess you have to love it, I guess, to some degree. And it's kind of like, I think, yeah, particularly for programming, I just like solving problems. And I think it's nice when you have problems that are really tractable, that not that they're easy to be solved, but you know that you can solve them. And I think that a lot of people who have the desire for that basically go and gravitate towards programming. And then they get kind of like put off when there's ways that those problems can be solved without them applying effort because they're kind of like, I wanted to solve that little problem. That would have been fun, that kind of thing, right? But there's always problems like that. And I think that's the thing, is to look for those kind of things if you're motivated by that. For me, it's been two things. I think one is basically empathy, because I'm kind of like, I know what it's like to feel really frustrated programming, and I want to basically help people avoid those kind of experiences, or to feel overwhelmed when you're confronting something which is unmanageable and hard to go and actually work with and stuff like that. And I guess secondarily, it's curiosity. Like I mentioned earlier, it's kind of like I just love figuring out how things work and different ways that things can work. So those things kind of, help me along. But I do go through periods, sometimes as long as a year, like when, if I, s- earlier in my career, I spent so much time thinking about software, it felt like it was all consuming. And so that's like not just at work, away from work, all that kind of stuff. And then you get in these burnout stages, and it's kind of like it lasts different amounts of time for different people. But I'm usually able to find, a way to get back to the drink from the well, of curiosity and helping people. And that's the thing that kind of motivates me with this stuff. So
Yeah,
that's just a personal thing. I don't know what that's going to be
that's
like for other
great.
people, what other things are like.
Well, I think those principles you mentioned are very on top of, certain tech stacks or tools and stuff like that. You can kind
Mhm.
of apply those to whatever's going on or whatever. I really do think, yeah, the curiosity, desire to solve problem, and like the reward of teaching and the empathy, it
Yeah.
resonates with me. So yeah. I will say I think we should bring back hipster dirigible mathematics. I think that would be a good way to kind of assuage our burnout at times, and maybe we can look at that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, let me offer you something that's kind of funny with that. Years ago, I thought like, what would be an interesting thing as a workshop exercise? It'd have to be like an extended workshop. I thought, so you remember like CVS, the version control system?
Hmm.
Yeah. And it was all written in C, and some of the code was really, really horrible. And I thought it'd be great to have like a weekend where you're working on kind of like refactoring that and making it better. And it's almost like nobody's going to use it, but it's also kind of like this thing of almost like refurbishing an old car, a car from like 50 years ago or something like, I think there's this interesting thing about going and doing the thing just for the hell of it, like dirigible mathematics. It's like, why not? You'll learn something, right? And it may be applicable. In fact, it likely is applicable in other work contexts, in other life contexts. So why not just go for the joy of it? Why not go for the thing?
I think at a cafe and you're 4/8, half the way to a theme park for nerds. Cool. All right. Let's wind up. Anything you want to plug? Where can people find you? Where can they see you
Um,
next?
I'm on LinkedIn quite a bit. I was on Twitter, or X now. I haven't really done very much with it recently. I'm working on a book called AI Assisted Programming, and it's on LeanPub, just under my name. And it's moving along. I deleted a lot of stuff recently because it keeps changing, but I'm basically making an effort to go and kind of like, add to it. There's a talk I feel particularly proud of called Where AI Meets Code from Go to Chicago 2024. that's worth looking into. And I'll be speaking at the Yao conference in Australia at the end of the year.
Nice.
And that's far away, but if you're over there, it'd be great to see you.
Great. Well, we'll put all those links in the follow up to this. Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much for everyone who attended. We hope to do more of this, and thank you again to Michael for being uh, our test pilot here.
Yes. Well, thank you. It's been cool.